So, had any good beers recently?
I have actually. I had one last night. It was the Aldi Brewdog crossover. Aldi IPA.
There was a sushi about that in the press a little while ago, but I've forgotten what it was all about. But they're just copying them or something.
They were copying them. I think Aldi were copying Brewdog. Brewdog got involved, and there was a bit
you mean
of
like the styling on the can?
The styling on the can,
colours
yeah. They're pretty good at that, Aldi. Yeah. And we love
Colin the Caterpillar.
Mega Puffs or whatever they are in the giant Watsits. But yeah, I think there was some sort of like Twitter spat over it, but eventually they shook hands and Brewdog just agreed to make a beer for Aldi. And I've got to say, first taste last night. I mean, It's been around for a while, but
I'm not
Mrs. Buckle treated me a weekly shop. So, but it was very good.
Good. Okay, I'm now going to make a beeline for Aldi and get some of that. I was thinking, though, of also looking out Guinness Zero. I didn't even realise they did it, but if there's anybody watching the Six Nations rugby at the moment, it's Guinness's big campaign for this tournament. And the on-pitch advertising and the billboards, it's all about Guinness Zero. And a few people I've been watching the rugby with said they've tried it and it's quite nice.
I'm going to admit to not being a huge Guinness fan.
I think there's a lot of people who say, I don't like Guinness, that's why I've never had it.
But maybe I'll try one, just to have,
It is a bit of a meal in itself.
Always,
Okay, I'll try some Aldi IPA and we can both try some Guinness Zero. Bring them in for next week's podcasts.
Review. It's gradually shifting.
We'll have the beer review slot.
Yeah, it's gradually shifting to a beer podcast.
A little jingle for that little slot of the podcast.
Beer of the week.
Beer of the week. Should we start the podcast?
We should. Yeah.
Okay. Hello and welcome to the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow. I'm Dave Parry, and with me as ever is Rich Buckle. Afternoon, Rich.
Afternoon.
So we're getting together again. This is dropping on St. Patrick's Day, actually. So turns out we were just talking about Guinness. That's all very appropriate.
Look at that.
But I'm not going to make you do the whole thing in a Blarney accent or anything like that. Just stick to normal. What we're going to talk about today is sort of relevant because this week it's budget week in the UK. And so we've been hearing Jeremy Hunt telling us what all the taxes and allowances are going to be doing. So we're not going to talk about that because there's plenty of other people doing all of the analysis of the budget. But it did make us think about budgets generally. What's the point? Do you need to do a budget?
Should you do a budget?
Is there any reason why you wouldn't do a budget? And let's be honest, we know a lot of people that don't do budgets.
Indeed. Because it is a bit of hard work, isn't it? It takes a bit of effort.
And I think isn't it really?
Everybody's busy.
Yeah.
If you don't need it, if you don't really need it, would you bother?
If you don't use it, it's just something to keep finance busy once a year, put a budget together. But why bother? And if you haven't got a finance department and you've got to do it yourself, again, why bother? So we thought we'd maybe explore
some of those
that subject. Find out if we can give you an excuse not to do it. There'll be some few people listening thinking, oh, this sounds good. I'm going to take this to my boss.
You could either put your budget together or drink some Guinness Zero.
Spend your budget on Guinness.
So, Well, what is a budget? We probably define it.
Well, yeah, and you're right, because a budget gets sort of confused with a few other terms, a business plan or a forecast and those sort of things. So it's probably worth just pulling that apart a little bit. All of those things have something in common in that they are a forward-looking view of the finances in some way, shape or form, right?
Yeah.
Probably at least a sales element, what we're going to sell, what's the income bit?
Yeah.
Probably a profit and loss. So given those sales, are we going to make, what are our costs and are we going to make any profit? And if you're really advanced, you'd be forecasting or budgeting or whatever, the balance sheet and the cash flow as well. So that's what they've all got in common. A budget, though, I would say, is probably a bit shorter, middle term, a year.
Yeah.
Of those three things we just talked about. Would you say that's probably fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think otherwise it's getting into too much of you're starting to stray more into business planning.
Yeah, which is a longer
term view.
That'd probably be 3 years, maybe sometimes 5, but at least 3.
Maybe linked to some larger investment, capex spending, that type of thing.
Yeah, certainly. That's got a different. We'll cover that uses of a business plan. That's a different thing for a different audience, maybe. Isn't it? But a business plan would also have other things in it, probably more words in it. In fact, maybe the budget, as we're talking about, is kind of a bit of the appendix.
The appendix, it's the financial section.
The boring numbers bit that everybody goes to first.
Yeah, year one, what's happening next year.
So if that's the difference between a budget and a business plan, the sort of 1 year versus 3 year, and maybe some different uses, where does the forecast sit? Is that a shorter term thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what they say about forecasts, isn't it? The one thing you can be certain of is it's going to be wrong, which I suppose you could apply to a budget as well if you wanted to.
Absolutely,
But yeah, I think, I suppose if a budget, I'm trying to think of an analogy here. If I go back to the old bowling ball analogy.
Oh, you like your bowling ball.
I like a bowling ball analogy. It works quite well with the bumpers. The budget would almost be, and I'm thinking on the fly here, the budget would almost be like, okay, hitting the pins at the end. Have we hit what we're supposed to be hitting? Yeah. And the guards are there. The forecast would almost be like, well, are we going to hit the buffers on the way down? Meters, how many times are we going to hit the buffers on the way to hitting the pins, maybe?
Yeah, no, okay. For thinking on the fly, I'll buy that.
Buy that.
Yeah. It's definitely a shorter term view. And certainly in the board meetings that we've both been in, where we change the forecast every month.
Yeah.
New information's arrived, the order book is different, we've invoiced some stuff, we've won some new orders, we've lost some, maybe we've taken on new people that we didn't expect. So the next 3 month view can be constantly moving. But if you rebudgeted every month, blink an heck, you'd disappear down.
I think it's maybe more event driven. If I'm just thinking of a situation over the last couple of months I've been in with a firm that the budget is set for the year based around a number of assumptions. The forecast, and by that it's mostly cash flow forecasting, which is, I suppose, largely driven by the sales forecasting. But because of the situation, it actually had to get into maybe a lot more detail than, so we might be forecasting monthly to start with, whereas the budget might be for the whole year, but we're looking at a monthly forecast or at least a month out. Depending on certain events that drive it, it was like, right, okay, now we've got to go to like a weekly forecast or maybe even a daily forecast. So you wouldn't go to a daily budget because you'd be like, well, what's the point? Daily forecast can be useful if things are getting tight and you need to be able to say, well, okay, can we stretch creditors or can we move this around, or
we'll get some more funding. Or
so it's, I think a forecast can be a lot more agile, maybe.
I think it has to be. It's probably for a more stronger purpose. Is that the right word? Yeah, a more pressing need.
It's for managing something, isn't it? Really, if you've got to manage a situation.
But you talked about cash flow forecasting there. Lots of businesses don't do cash flow forecasting. Now, that's perfectly okay, I suppose, if you've got either plenty of cash or very profitable business so that you know that you're going to be growing out of whatever position you're in. The people who do cash flow forecasting almost down to that daily version, let alone weekly, are those that are up against the buffers. And if they get that wrong and end up paying a supplier too soon or making a decision that costs money, you could go bust. So you have to have a very tight handle on the cash. But that's definitely a forecasting thing.
Yeah.
And even going back to profit and loss forecasting, looking 2-3 months out, that's useful for saying, well, hang on a minute, we're going to be entering a lean period. Let's hold back on that recruitment or that investment. Or conversely, we've got a bumper time coming up soon. We're going to need more people. You know, the sales forecast has just gone up by 50%. Operations aren't geared up to deal with that yet. So operations director, get some more people on board. So that's the short-term reacting. But you wouldn't do a re-budget then.
No.
But I think there are still reasons for doing a re-budget mid-year.
I think if something fundamentally shifted in the business, then it would almost be, well, it would be a bit cavalier just to carry on as if, if you're fundamental, like, I think with your budget, it's got to be underpinned by assumptions, and I guess we'll talk about that in a bit. If those assumptions fundamentally change, there's no point carrying on as if they haven't.
Well, but you know what, though? You see that. You see where the budget is completely blown to pieces one way or another. Something like you say, an assumption has just changed, or a major thing has happened. So clearly the budget isn't worth the paper it's written on anymore. There's no way it's going to be delivered on a month-to-month basis, let alone year to date. Yeah. And yet businesses carry on reporting their accounts compared to budget. Well, this is for the birds. Why bother? Surely then, mid-year, you say, come on, let's do the budget again. Let's re-budget.
Well, I had a situation yesterday where I was looking at some accounts, and the actual year to date, and bear in mind we're period 9 or something, so reasonable chunk through the year. Yeah. The actual on the sales, the variance to budget was 1%. I thought that's not too bad actually.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah.
But when you actually break down what was going on, the actual kind of sort of sales line was pretty bang on. That wasn't too bad. The change in the whip on the budget, because the whips in the budget was something like minus 150% or something.
Right.
And the change in the interest that had been earned on investments and things was up by about 3,000. Now, the overall impact of that netted each other off.
Right.
And so if you actually looked at it, you'd say, "Oh, that's pretty well forecast." Now, the whip and the
so
the
were they
interest,
lucky then?
That's just more luck. I said that this is more luck than judgment.
Yeah.
But again, I suppose it's looking at those assumptions. We'd assume certain things.
Yeah.
You know, clearly interest rates had gone up in the year that no one was forecasting. You know, if we think back a year ago, or probably 12 months ago when the budgets were being put together.
Wouldn't have expected
interest rates to go that high.
And there's some pretty generous accounts around at the moment if you put money on deposit, aren't they? Certainly larger sums. Yeah, you wouldn't have expected that. So there is a reason when rebudgeting may happen mid-year, but on the whole, you'd like to think a budget would last a year.
Yeah.
Forecast gets updated monthly, but at the highest level, and a business plan is a bigger thing that maybe lasts 3 years or 5 years. So just a thought then, what do you use a business plan for differently from a budget? Because we said one is kind of a subset of the other anyway, aren't they? So
I think you could, obviously you could slice this different ways, but I think maybe a business plan is probably a little bit more externally focused. Maybe you're trying to get investors, you've got external shareholders, you're trying to, show the bank that actually we've got a team here that can deliver on these numbers.
Well, you certainly have it for a startup, but you're right, sometimes you do it midstream, an established business. We've done a couple in our time of full-on sort of 3 to 5 year business plans with bios of the key members of staff and a competitor analysis and all those things that go into a business plan. But you wouldn't do that every year normally for a stable, ongoing business, would you?
No, I guess you may tweak it a little bit, but I guess the point of having the 3 to 5 year plan is that it's a 3 to 5 year plan that you sort of stick to, isn't it?
It gives you that longer term, something to aim for. But if you're applying for a grant, they will definitely expect a 3-year business plan with all the financial forecasts. If you've got banks that are heavily
definitely see it with the banks. I've done a number of those where the banks really want to see that there is a plan behind the numbers.
Yeah.
And so it's maybe not a full-blown business plan, but it's definitely a kind of, there's some objectives here and there's a timing plan and we're going to do some activity that's going to change what these numbers look like. That's kind of
an apocryphal suggestion here, just to sort of line it up a bit. But do you think when a bank gets a business plan for a business, they scan it in, put it in the folder marked Company XYZ business plan and move on? Or do you think they go through it with a fine-tooth comb and ask detailed questions?
Well, I think, in my experience, the bank only really tend to ask for these things if they're either you're looking for investment off them.
You want more money.
So they want more money. And ironically, they only really tend to give money to people that don't really need it.
Yeah.
But they also really want a business plan when you're looking at business support situations, which from time to time, a number of companies get themselves
a bit more closer scrutiny.
And they want to know that they're not just going to keep. So oftentimes you might be looking for an overdraft extension or some more funding or something. And they want to know that you're going to get the business back on track. And I think, in my experience, they very much do look at those plans.
Yeah, interesting then. So they do in those circumstances where the chips are down. Maybe different people get involved from the bank.
They do.
As opposed to your normal,
Yeah, it's not your relationship directors normally still involved, but you've got special business support people that come along.
And same with the credit committees, I suppose. If you're asking for a reasonable amount of extra input of debt, then the credit committee will no doubt go over it in more detail. You just don't necessarily see that as the customer, the bank's customer.
Yeah.
It's all happening behind the scenes, and your relationship director just comes back saying, thanks for that, they've ticked it off. Or you don't know what.
Well, I would say any business support situation with a bank, they're going to be they definitely look at the plan, and they keep pretty, not close tabs on it, but they're very interested to see, have you hit these key milestones?
Have you hit the budget?
Have you, reduced the headcount, or have you got that new, kind of division up and running so that it's going to generate the sales or moved off?
So it's not just the numbers in that case, is it? It's the actions that are implied by your plan. Yeah. Okay, so let's think then, we've done the contrast between the budget and the business plan. Let's think more about the budget and ask ourselves, what's that really used for? Because if we're trying to help people come to a view here as, are they right not to be doing one, or are they wrong to be doing one? I don't know. what's their main uses? So I tend to think of this a bit in time terms. So when you're preparing one, you get some uses out of that, some benefits maybe that. When you're running through the period that you've done the budget for, that's of use. And then just having one at all and maybe looking back on how well you did, that's a kind of a different sort of thing. So I'm trying to think in that first bit where you're writing one, that almost makes you ask a lot of questions, doesn't it?
Yeah. So you're going to look at, well, I suppose you want to think about who needs to be involved. If you're going to start thinking about who are the decision makers here, who do you need around you to collect information. Now, that's obviously going to just depend on the size of your organisation, isn't it? It might be that you've got departments, so you've got department heads that need to get involved, and if it's you're not such a big company, it might just be that you've got to make the time to sit down and think about it.
You've got to do it yourself, but it does force you to think with each of those functional heads or whatever they are, what are our priorities? Yeah. And if we've got a certain amount of income and some existing costs that we could either reduce or increase, where are we reflecting our priorities in those decisions? Which is very similar, if you like, to the government budget that we said triggered the thought this week, that all they're really doing is signalling certain areas are more important or less important. They're going to put a bit more into defence because of the situation in Ukraine. They're going to tweak the tax arrangements around pensions because they think that will encourage more 50-somethings to not retire early. They're going to tweak the child benefit arrangements and childcare arrangements. It's all just about trying to nudge behaviour a bit. And maybe it's the same in a company to some extent. If we say our research and development budget goes up by 50%, that's signalling that we're taking that seriously, or we're cutting it back, or we're not spending so much on marketing, or we're spending more on marketing. All these things, questions you have to ask yourself and come up with answers for, because the numbers that come out of it will dictate what actually happens.
And that's where maybe having a process around the putting the budget together could be useful, because you're going to want to ask all those questions. B, where do you get your data from? What data are you reviewing to say, last year's budget was this year's budget? A lot of people just sort of like, okay, what did we do last year? Let's just roll that over. Finger in the air, 3% or whatever, put that on. But, to give it a sort of marketing spin, as it were, do you look at your where are your customers coming from? Have you seen that grow in certain, what's your product mix looking like? Does that change over the year?
Well, there's a strategic element to that then as well, isn't it? Rather than just saying our sales are going to go up by 3%, 5%, 10%, whatever it is. Break it down to the next level down, by region maybe, or by product, or by type of sale channel. All of those things could prompt very interesting discussions that, this area is underperforming. Let's either kill it off or invest more in it to bring it up to scratch. So it does force you to have some more strategic discussions once a year.
And I think that's more important if you've got maybe different departments or different divisions in a business that have different cost structures, different margins. You don't want to just have a single line sales number. And we've got examples before where they're very, very almost different businesses all under one umbrella with very different kind of sales and cost of goods sold, margins,
cycles, working capital requirements,
all
investment needs. Yeah, so it's good to have all that flushed out. And then, if you think the other point, when we're still in the preparation phase of a budget, then you're referring that to your 5-year goals. We mentioned those at the top. That helps you think: are we actually getting 1 year closer to our 5-year goal if we run the year like this?
Yeah.
And it may be that you've got some elements of your 5-year goal, your strategy, which could be quite explicitly financial. If you've got a lot of debt, for example, one of your goals might be to get debt-free. Yeah. Or it might be to make an acquisition, in which case we've got to build a war chest. Yeah. Or it might be to get better buying power with suppliers by paying them quicker. Yeah. So there could be very explicit financially related things that you're trying to achieve, which you've got to build into your budget, otherwise they just won't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, and just a final point on that one, another point on it is to say if you're involving other people, they can take ownership of their budget, isn't it? Yeah. So do you want a budget forced on you? In some cases, that's going to happen just because of the way it is. Or are you delegating that and letting people take ownership of as part of a process, maybe.
Yeah, let's come back to that in a minute, because I think that's really important, that how you put a budget together and whether you hand it down on tablets of stone or whether it's some sort of version of a collaborative experience. So that's important. Hold that thought.
Hold that thought held.
So we've done the preparation. Let's imagine now we're in flight, as they say. So we're in the period where we budgeted, in the year, let's say, where we budgeted for, and things are happening and we're starting to report on results. We've got actual results coming through. The first use of that budget is to get accounts to present your monthly results alongside the budget for that month and just see what was the difference.
Yeah.
Are we ahead of budget? Are we behind budget? Year to date, are we ahead of budget? Are we behind budget?
Well, interesting thing here that we've seen is that accounts or the finance people in the room know exactly where to go when they're comparing those numbers, don't they? And everyone else, I guess if you're looking at the spreadsheets all day, it's normally a spreadsheet, isn't it? These numbers get presented in or something like that. You know where to look. It's easy to see whether the variance is out or whatever it is. And we found over the years that a lot of other people in the room who are maybe responsible for the budget for that particular area, or they get presented with a set of numbers, and not everybody is a numbers
What do you mean,
person,
like a sheet of paper
covered in numbers with
yeah.
some of them red, some of them in little brackets, or, what does this all mean? So maybe it's worth just touching on briefly how to present those numbers so that people actually own that budgeting process.
And we developed this approach, didn't we, on this in a number of the board meetings. And you're right to call out the fact that the finance people never saw the need to change it because they're quite comfortable with it. But as soon as we presented a more graphical version of things, especially showing cumulative, year-to-date numbers as it's evolved through the year, rather than just a snapshot of where are we year-to-date, and showing each of the months one by one, comparing it to the budget monthly, and maybe even comparing it to last year, that's useful. All of this stuff went on a piece of paper with numbers, looks really messy and numbers rich. But we came up with this version that we've refined over the years. And I would say almost without exception, for the non-financial people in the room, they said, that's what's been happening. Oh my goodness.
So it was like a graphical P&L, wasn't it? So what do we call it?
The accounts viewer or the graphical P&L.
Great name.
Yeah, how did we come up with that?
But I think importantly, really, it did tell the story, didn't it? So we tried to take it all the way through from inquiry to kind of cash received.
Oh, that was version. That was good. Yeah, so the whole business cycle. So people might think of it to start with as starting with sales, taking off your cost of sales, get to gross profit, take off your overheads, get to net profit. There's your P&L bit. But you're right, up front of that, before you get to sales, you've got some lead indicators. Yeah. So how many inquiries have we had, and maybe even a value of those? How many quotes have we produced, and what value of them, and what orders have we received? All of that could be months or sometimes years ahead of it hitting an invoice line. So really powerful lead indicator stuff. And then after the profit bit at the bottom, the net profit, you've got some balance sheet stuff. So what's happened with our debtors? You can only have debtors if you've invoiced. So, are they going up or down? Are our debtor days changing? Creditors, are we paying our suppliers on time? What's the stock levels doing? Yeah. And the result of all of that, the cash, because it only makes sense once you've been paid for it.
Exactly, cash is king.
Well, there's probably another episode on that. We'll have to talk through our accounts viewer graphical P&L.
But I think, but it is part of that, I think, when you're in a budget, you're comparing some numbers, some actual numbers to a budget, making sure that the people who are accountable for delivering those numbers actually understand them and can see them within a wider context is quite important.
Well, there's another thing that crops up there with the analysis of any difference, variance analysis, if you want to go into that. Sometimes we see people into explaining mode rather than analysis mode, if you think there's a difference there. So they like to come up with, quote unquote, the excuse for why something is above or below where it should be. Yeah. And as long as we've explained it, fine, move on. Well, that may be an appropriate response. If that was a one-off, we all knew what was happening at the time, it's not going to happen again, or we're under control or whatever. But sometimes the appropriate response is to say, this keeps happening. Maybe it's not that exact situation, but we keep having one-offs.
Yeah, you can't have exceptional items every month.
No, exactly. and sometimes you do. So there's got to be a trigger when you're reviewing the accounts against the budget or whatever yardstick that you actually decide to take some action. Yeah. If the fourth month on the trot, we haven't hit the sales forecast, we're starting to get a bit worried about the pipeline, you've got to open the debate at some point about whether we react. Do we weather the storm, get some more funding to see this through, or eat into the reserves, or do we start reducing the cost or changing strategy or something? So this is where I think businesses fall out of love with the idea of the budget,
Yeah.
Because even if you've gone to all the bother of making one and you're comparing your results, if actually all you do every month is just explain it away and nothing changes, well, you could have saved yourself a lot of trees being torn down to print all the budgets off, right?
I suppose there's another thing there that could be around kind of what happens if you're in the budget. We're in the budget now. We've made it. We're in the year. We're running the budget. What happens when you start bumping up against your limit on your budget? So if a marketing budget might be, I don't know, 5K a month ad spend, but you see a really good opportunity. Yeah. Is there anything in that where companies
want to go over? And I think there is I can see very different attitudes, probably depending on whether the person responsible has come from a bigger company or maybe from something public sector or a smaller entrepreneurial SME. Because the bigger companies tend to treat these budgets like they're cast in stone. You cannot exceed that. And if you go over this month, we've got to go under next month, otherwise your job's on the line. But the entrepreneurial approach would be to say, if there's an opportunity that presents itself, even if it's outside budget, as long as there's a rationale, a return on investment of some sort or some other driver, that's okay. Just make sure you've got internal processes to escalate it and make sure everybody's approved of that. So you're right, we shouldn't take budgets as absolute black and white, don't spend more than, in most cases, although it's certainly true that in large organisations and certainly public sector, they are treated much more like that. So depends on your context.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Is it always context sensitive, I suppose, isn't it, with these things?
So we've talked about preparing the budget, running with them in flight and comparing and coming up with variances and changing actions. I think the other point worth noting is what's the benefit of having had a budget, certainly if you can show a track record.
Yeah.
And I'd say when you come to business sales, M&A activity and due diligence processes, or even like you talked about earlier, asking a funder for more funding, if you can show a track record where we hit our budgets every year, then when you give them that next budget, that just gives that sense that this business is under control, people know what the levers are, they manage to adapt accordingly. It gives a huge warm feeling.
It's confidence, isn't it?
Yeah, confidence of how it's being run.
Absolutely. And I think that's, again, and it's maybe having that, the budget review process. Does that happen? Do you sit down and review how the budget went last year versus, as part of almost the preparation
for the next one? Well, that brings us on to how do you prepare them? And you mentioned earlier about getting other people involved, but the best versions I've seen are where you alluded to it earlier. You have the budget holders or the functional heads present their own budget and bring it together, which maybe the FD has consolidated to come up with what does that mean for the business. Yeah. Probably starts with the sales director or maybe the marketing director saying, this is, if we get this amount in, what money do you all need to deliver on it? Whatever it may be. You bring it all up and it comes to a number at the bottom right-hand corner of the spreadsheet, which invariably at first pass is unacceptable to the stakeholders because everybody's throwing the kitchen sink at it, seeing what they can get away with. So then you had a number of iterations and it's up to each functional head to argue their case and come up with that return on investment argument for saying, no, I do need an extra person or this new piece of software or whatever it may be.
And I think that's where it comes down to that process of really testing your assumptions on everything, isn't it? Yeah. So that's where the one line in the spreadsheet for, staff or something doesn't really work. You've got to almost break that down and say, right, okay, well, I need this person to do this thing and deliver on this, and this person to do this, and they're going to come in here, and there's going to be a recruitment cost associated with that, or those sorts of things. Really, to make it you've got to present a credible case, haven't you? Really.
Yeah, and if there's one thing I could change when people do their budgets, it's to make the assumptions more explicit and the actions required. Who's going to take what action to deliver this budget? It's not. The output shouldn't just be a set of numbers. Yeah. A budget isn't there to come up with a spreadsheet output. A budget is there to say, if this is the version of the future that we're happy with, what do we have to do now and through the year to make it happen?
Yeah. It'd be great in a way, wouldn't it, if you could actually come up with the task list, almost a checklist that comes out of it. Yeah. So this is the financial plan to deliver this. We've got to do this in January, this in February, and these are the key tasks. And have we done those? Yeah.
And you may have come up with similar things where you've seen this depicted graphically again with something either called a rainbow chart or a walkthrough, the Americans call it, where you start with a bar at the beginning, which is how maybe last year went, and the one at the far right of the graph is how next year is. But there'll be lots of ups and downs that get you from the first one to the second one. Each of those is a thing that you're going to make happen or that will happen anyway. Yeah. So, that's important then.
Are there any other ways you can put budgets together?
Well, I think we should mention zero-based budgeting, Not many people are a big fan of it. It takes an awful long time to do it. It's a very thorough way of doing it. And you just strip it back to the bare bones, and every single thing you put in the budget has to be justified. To do that well, you've probably got to have activity-based costing, so all your overheads can be allocated to different activities, and it will take an awful lot longer every year to do it. There's no doubt that larger companies may choose to go that route, but I think for the audience we're talking about here, that SME, small entrepreneurial business, that's just too much effort, and it tends to therefore be a more incremental approach. What did it cost last year? Put a bit on for inflation or wage rises, add in the recruits, take off the bits we're not doing anymore. Where does that leave us, and does that work?
Yeah. Well, I've always found that they evolve quite quickly when you actually start and sit down and really look at a budget. You can take quite a glib, well, that's what it was last year. Let's just, get it over with quickly, put a couple of % on here and there. But if you really do take the time, put a day aside or something, again, we're talking to SME kind of audience here, but, a day or two aside to really think through, well, what's going on with, staffing, or what
do we need to challenge this cost? Every year we pay X for this thing. Do we really need it?
Do we understand
need that extra office or that bit of storage space or that piece of kit? Or especially with all of these SaaS licenses that we all accumulate, how many of those do we still need for next year? And that brings us to when should you do it as well? Because you wouldn't believe how many companies I see putting their budget together in month 1 or 2 of the financial year. So by the time they've signed it off, 10-20% of the year is already gone. Yeah. So I would say start maybe 3 months before. So for people with calendar years, maybe start thinking about it in September, October time. Yeah. For the April starts, it's a great sort of January back to work sort of after Christmas activity. What about the main pitfalls? What goes wrong with budgeting?
Too high level. I mean, we've touched on that a number of times in this, but it's
sales as one line, staff as one line, overheads as maybe 3 or 4 lines. Yeah, what are you going to do with that? As soon as you get a variance, it could be a million different things.
Not taking into account things like product mix, those sorts of things.
Sort of level. I think the other thing that I've seen recently actually is where the assumptions you made in the budget go out of date very quickly. And we mentioned that earlier. Okay, maybe time for a re-budget rather than just a forecast.
Things like interest rates, that type of thing.
Change, or if you're expecting a big order to land in month 1, but it came in earlier and it's now fallen to last year. So, that's going to fundamentally floor all of your years, isn't it?
Use it or lose it mentality.
Yeah, no, I suppose that's why budgets have got a bad name, especially in a public sector or a large company environment where you're a cost centre, not a profit centre, and you've been given an amount of money to spend. And the threat is if you don't get through that money by the end of your financial year, then obviously you didn't need it, so you won't get it next year. And how many businesses do we work with where for the last 2 or 3 months of whichever financial year we're talking about, there's a spending bonanza? And for some businesses, it's November, December. Some businesses, it's more like February, March before the public sector end of year. Some, it's around August time because of the end of the education sector financial year. So it's bizarre when you look at some businesses, how cyclical they are, how seasonal they are, because of these financial year effects.
And if you do have budget left over, you can email me at richard.buckle@wellmeadow.co.uk.
You can find a good use for it. I think the last one to mention as well, people will have heard of the term sandbagging. And I think everybody's guilty of it to some degree or another, but it's where you over or underestimate how much you need to make it easier for you to deliver on your budget. And there's a little bit of putting in the contingency that you might not need. And I think it's up to the budgetary process and the team together to collectively try and flush that out. It's okay having contingencies, but don't come up with a completely fictional budget just so you can prove you've beaten it. Yeah. But unfortunately, if bonuses are tied on this sort of thing, then that's the sort of behaviour you get.
Yeah, it drives it. So I guess the big question, is it okay not to have a budget?
Well, maybe. A bit like we said earlier about short, daily cash flow forecasting. You don't have to do that. So there are probably circumstances where if you're a smaller business where the owner is making nearly all of the decisions or has oversight of the decision, or the owners do. If you're profitable, if you've got enough cash, if your business is quite stable, you should probably, it'd be foolish of us to say you don't need one, but you could get away without having one, and many businesses do, if those circumstances are true.
I think maybe that's to maybe take it a step further to say you probably have a budget, but you just haven't written it down in that instance.
Yeah,
in your head, you've probably got an idea of, well, I know the sales are going to be this, and I can afford that, and it's kind of roughly, gut feel feels right, but it's not articulated anywhere.
If you got your handle on the business and you know that your labour cost should be about 40% of your sales, material cost 20%, and there's 20% of overhead and the rest is for me, then you can sort of clock that, can't you, every month, even if it's just watching the bank statement as to what's coming in and out and looking at the payroll every week, every month. So I think there are reasons why somebody may legitimately decide not to bother committing a budget to paper, but there are also lots of reasons when you're going to have to do it.
You're going to have to do it. Yeah, I think it's probably a wise thing to do. I think businesses that run themselves just off the bank balance,
that's a bit dodgy.
Bit scary.
Maybe introduce those businesses to the concept of a balance sheet and make them realise how important that might be. There are liabilities hiding in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you not doing budgets, maybe that's okay, but just have a think about it. Think about everything we've said, and maybe there's something in there that at least gets you doing a version of one. Start off the process. All right.
Indeed.
Good. Well, that's it for budgets. Not the most exciting of subjects, but it's one of those things that growing companies, I think, have to consider as they grow, because it's going to be a part of their future as they go into one of those next stages of growth.
Absolutely.
Good. Well, thank you very much again for listening. This is the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow. Please subscribe, like, share the podcast with your friends, and most importantly, tell all your business colleagues that we're here and that we're worth a listen. And good luck with your businesses. If you want some more information on the graphical P&L and accounts viewer, then please go to our website at wellmeadow.co.uk. Until next week.